I absolutely adored Link's Awakening back in the day. I have very fond memories of playing the Game Boy Color re-release shortly after beating Ocarina of Time. In fact, up until Breath of the Wild came out, it was my favourite Legend of Zelda game. I've even said this on camera back in 2014, take a look.
I'm not actually necessarily a giant fan of Ocarina of Time. I know it's not your favorite Zelda game.
Yeah, my personal favorite is Link's Awakening, yours is?
Link to the Past.
So when this full-fledged remake was announced, I was excited, yet at the same time skeptical. Not because of the art style, but because it's a remake of a Game Boy game. Still, Nintendo did recently pull off a successful Game Boy remake in Pokémon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. So could they still surprise me? Name's Dave with MojoPlays, and this is my review of The Legend of Zelda, Link's Awakening for the Nintendo Switch. If you haven't played Link's Awakening before, let me give you a quick rundown. One day while Link is sailing at sea, his boat gets ripped apart by a violent storm, leaving him shipwrecked on a mysterious island, with its most notable landmark being a towering mountain with an egg nested in its crater. After Link retrieves his sword, he is advised by a mysterious owl that he must wake the windfish in order to leave this island, and in order to do that he has to travel to the 8 dungeons and collect 8 musical instruments. Some of the series' most notable staples here are missing, such as Hyrule, the Triforce, or Princess Zelda herself. But what we do have is a rather bizarre world filled with crazy Nintendo cameos. Upon booting up the game, a strong wave of nostalgia hit me immediately. Seeing Marin and Link in an adorable ceramic doll theme, along with the rearrangement of the original theme, was beautiful! The presentation in this game is gorgeous! Probably the cutest Legend of Zelda game out there, pushing out the Wind Waker. NPCs animate incredibly well, and the diorama-like world lends itself well to exploring Koholint Island. Speaking of which, unlike the original Game Boy version, the screen always stays fixed over Link while he's in the overworld, with screen-scrolling sections reserved for caves and dungeons. It's not a seamless transition though. The frame rate notably takes a hit whenever you move into a new region in Koholint, so while this is mildly annoying, it is a better trade-off than load times. Of course, this being a remake of a Game Boy title, there are some significant quality of life improvements, and by far the best change comes with the controls. Because the Game Boy only had 2 action buttons, it meant that in the original, you had to frequently bring up your inventory screen to change your active items. With the Switch having far more action buttons, I found myself rarely bringing up my inventory until the very last few dungeons, allowing for a very streamlined experience. You still have 2 interchangeable buttons in X and Y, but the other buttons are reserved for the most important equipment. B for your sword, A to pick up pots, the R buttons for your shield, and L buttons for the Pegasus boots. That said, Link doesn't have full 360-degree movement. Instead, he only moves in 8 directions like the original game. I wouldn't have minded this if it weren't for the fact that movement is hard mapped to the analog stick. The D-pad can't be used at all. As a result, moving around can be rather stiff and restrictive at times, especially with the freedom of an analog stick. Which brings me to the game itself. Some of the most notable changes from the original include revamped combat with armed enemies, as they now require you to parry with your shield in order for them to drop their guard. There's also the new hero mode, where the player takes double damage and there are no heart drops. And then there's Dungeon Arranger mode, located in Dampy Shack, which I'll get to later. Link can also now find an assortment of bottles which he can use to store fairies. And while they do make the game notably easier, they don't automatically revive Link if he goes down. That's still reserved for the secret medicine, which can still be found in this game. But aside from these small changes, the game is practically identical to the original. Too identical, in fact. All the rooms are the same, the dialogue is the same right down to the specific words, the boss fights are the same, the story is identical, and the dungeons and puzzles are nearly identical. And the latter is a notable problem, repeating puzzles. Even though I haven't played the game in at least a decade, I was still able to breeze through it, and the deeper I got, the more I realized I was just going through the motions of what I had done before. The puzzles aren't that complex either. Once you figure them out, it's very easy to finish them. I think the game may have been streamlined a little too much because I finished the main game in about 7 hours, and that includes the 9th color dungeon that was added in the DX re-release on Game Boy Color. Here's the thing, Link's Awakening was released all the way back in 1993. The original cartridge was 1/4 megabyte, so the decision to bring it back as a 1-to-1 recreation also brings with it some of the original and, dare I say, outdated design issues. The 5th dungeon, Catfish Moor, is a slog to get through in particular, because it requires frequent backtracking, as the player has to chase a giant Stalfos across different rooms at the far ends of the dungeon, in order to get the hook shot that he stole. Though I gotta say the 8th dungeon, Turtle Rock, has some notable improvements. For one, you can no longer instantly die if you go into the room full of lava by accident. Nevertheless, it's rather frustrating that Nintendo has taken this direction to do a 1-for-1 remake, because what worked in the 90s doesn't quite hold up to 2019 scrutiny. Yes, we've seen many remakes of 90s titles in the past few years, but titles like the Crash and Spyro remakes worked because they were reviving dormant genres and IPs, while Resident Evil 2 was completely rebuilt with a brand new modern format. Link's Awakening doesn't fall into any of those camps. I would have been more forgiving of this approach if it was a budget title like the original game was at launch, but Nintendo is charging $60 for this game. Then, there's the biggest new feature of the game, the Chamber Dungeon, which is the closest thing we get to substantial new post-game content. In this mode, Dampé tasks you with creating special dungeon layouts with certain requirements, and then tackle them yourself. Sometimes the tasks he gives have some cool modifiers, such as only having 3 hearts or not being able to use your sword. But if you were expecting this to be some form of Zelda Maker with a thriving online community, prepare to be disappointed because there are some fundamental issues that's holding this mode back. For one, dungeons are hobbled together using rooms you've already cleared from the main game, which means the mode can start to feel repetitive rather quickly. You also can't map out sub-areas, which can cause entire design plans to fall apart if tunnels go to the rooms right next to each other, leaving other areas completely isolated, forcing you to redesign your dungeon all over again. But the mode's most glaring problem is sharing the stages you've made. In a move that defies all common logic, you cannot share your creations online. Instead, you can only share your creations with friends by uploading them to Amiibos. Only Nintendo could have botched a user-generated feature this badly. Hey Nintendo, if you're gonna charge us for using an online service, how about having your games actually use the online service? Oh my god! Oh, it pains me to say this considering how much I love the original, but the Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening remake is a disappointment. If you've never played this game before, you might still find enjoyment with the title, but don't expect something as full-fledged as Breath of the Wild, or even A Link to the Past, which you can now get with the Switch membership SNES games. What we have is a fantastic, handheld retro title being passed off as a $60 console title with some baffling design choices, and less incentive to stick around. If you need some flavor text to sum up this review in one sentence, well, it's basically the video game equivalent to the Lion King remake we got earlier this year. Be sure to check out this other recent clip from MojoPlays, and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos.